Is there an association between drug use and delinquency? The relationship between drug use and delinquency, particularly as it relates to violent criminal activity, has been the subject of much study and debate. One linkage is that drugs alter behavior by reducing inhibitions and instilling aggressive and violent tendencies. Another link is economically compulsive violence occurs when individuals commit violent crime in their effort to secure money to purchase drugs for their own use. Such an example would be like robbing somebody. And lastly, systemic violence occurs during turf battles and struggles for control in the drug dealing and street trafficking subculture. So, crimes may be an instrument, just to recap, crimes may be an instrument of the drug trade. Users may also commit crimes to pay for their habits. Users may be more willing to take risks as inhibitions are lowered by the substance abuse. There are a number of studies that have been conducted to analyze the association between alcohol and drug abuse and delinquency. One such conducted by the National Institute of Justice Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring. Boy, these names, let's just call it ADAM, is what it's referred to, the National Institute of Justice's Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring. Tracks trends in drug use among arrestees in urban areas. So these are the folks who've been arrested. And most recent report, which is recent 2002, so almost 20 years ago, found that almost 60% of juvenile males and 30% of juvenile females tested positive for marijuana. So there was drugs in the system of arrestees. And I'm going to note that because of how old this report is, hopefully there will be a new one, because I anticipate that is going to be, that gap will probably, between men and women, will probably be a lot smaller. At least that's what studies show in other areas. With the exception of meth, males more likely than females to test positive for the use of all other drugs. So females more likely to test for methamphetamines. A study conducted by McCurley and Snyder found that higher levels of youth problem behaviors and delinquency, such as school suspension or carrying weapons, are associated with drug use and distribution. For example, students who drank alcohol in the past 30 days had also been suspended from school. So there were other behaviors involved. The relationship between delinquency and drug use, well, has been established by many studies. It's far from certain whether drug use causes delinquency leads youth to engage in substance abuse, or both. Drug abuse and delinquency are functions of some other factor. Some researchers argue that drugs and delinquency are associated because both are caused by the same third variables. The data do indicate that drug use and drug sales and delinquency share many of the same causes, such as individual traits, family problems, school problems, and association with delinquent peers. Also, some researchers argue that drugs and delinquency are associated because delinquency causes drug use or drug sales. Engaging in delinquency increases the likelihood that a person will be exposed to others who possess or use drugs, who reinforce drug use, and who hold values conducive to drug use. The data here indicate that delinquency increases the likelihood of subsequent drug use. At the same time, the evidence suggests that drug use, especially serious drug use, does contribute to delinquency. For example, although drug addicts typically engage in crime before they become addicts, their level of crime increases during periods of high drug use and decreases during periods of low drug use. Much of the association between drugs and delinquency arises because both are caused by the same third variable, and because delinquency has an effect on drug use. So it's not quite clear in that arena, but there are 3 different interpretations. So how do we control drugs? There's billions of dollars that are spent annually, billions, to reduce the importation of drugs, deter drug dealers, and treat users. A number of strategies have been employed to deter drug use, stopping the flow of drugs into the country, apprehending dealers, and cracking down on street-level drug dealers. Another approach is educating potential users and convincing them to, quote-unquote, say no to drugs. And a third approach is to treat users so they can cease buying and using drugs. So let's discuss these efforts in more detail, starting with law enforcement efforts. Law enforcement, they aim to deter drug control by stopping the flow of drugs into the country, apprehending those who deal drugs, and taking the street-level drug dealers off the street, cracking down on them. And one form is called source control. There's a few different forms we'll talk about. Source control first. This is designed to punish known dealers and users with hefty penalties, and to deter those who are thinking of entering the drug trade. So it focuses on getting rid of the source. And this is easier said than done. Federal government has been going after drug cartels in foreign countries. The United States has even successfully and unsuccessfully worked with foreign governments to control efforts. But usually what happens when they get an agreement to work with a foreign government, the drug suppliers, they just find another country or another farm or grower to work with, or they employ intimidation tactics against the governments that are working with the United States. So certainly this is a battle, and you can see some of the examples and statistics in the book of the attempts that the United States has tried to do, especially with some of the South American countries. Border control. This is designed to intercept drug supplies as they enter the country. But unfortunately, there's a big border and lots of ways to get drugs into the country. Only a small percentage of drugs are actually intercepted. Another border control effort is targeting internet drug traffickers from foreign countries, such as designer drugs is a big drug that gets sold on the internet because it's legal in some countries, not legal here. It's very hard to intercept the sale and trafficking of drugs through the internet because it's really hard to detect. And there are some examples relative to that, but there were some success stories, one out of Buffalo. But the extent that the drug sellers try to hide it, it's very difficult to control. But if we were to stop all the importation of drugs, if that was to cease, we have another issue: homegrown or lab-made drugs here on our own soil, such as marijuana, methamphetamines, ecstasy. These are all produced on our own soil, and it's very easy to create and make and grow. And what would happen is these things would, and they already kind of are growing in popularity, but they would become the ultimate drug of choice. And they're currently easy to get now, and they're cheap to make, cheap to buy. It's very attractive. However, law enforcement has been making some headway, shutting down these illegal meth labs, which actually has been declining over the years. The government seems to think the reason for the decline is the new regulations that restrict the access to retail sales of the once over-the-counter medicines that contain the ingredients for meth. But you can read about the actual examples of the meth labs being shut down. You may already have heard of them in our area. It was very common and attractive over the last several years. Targeting dealers is the other way law enforcement attempts to control drugs. The efforts focus on drug trafficking and busting the large-scale drug rings. Police, what they do is conduct street-level busts of the dealers and the users. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. If you're picking up these street-level dealers who are dealing because they need to feed their habit, they become the confidential informants, and the hope is that leads them to the bigger target or the kingpin in the dealer. And it does create crowding. It is a bit of a hassle. There are problems. 80%, they say cracking down results in 80% increase in violence. And the drug sweeps overcrowd our correctional facilities and drain police resources. The police do spend a lot of energy and time and money in drug trafficking, but drug trafficking is a big deal. And I'd say half of my cases involve drugs in some fashion, and in some instances more than half of the caseload that I've had to deal with. A lot of folks are from out of the area. So it's certainly a problem nonetheless. So law enforcement efforts. Number one, let's talk about educational programs. Educational programs are aimed at reducing teenage substance abuse. And this happens in school. And I'm happy to say that a majority of the public schools, if not all, have implemented drug education programs. It begins in kindergarten and extends through 12th grade. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with DARE, the DARE program. And another program is called Project Alert. And these focus on education strategy, lots of in educating children with regards to drug use. Just say no to drugs. One of the focuses of education strategies is the media's influence on adolescents and the use of drugs. Also, alcohol and cigarettes fall into this category too. When we say drugs, they focus on them all, but DARE is drugs and alcohol. According to the National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign, most 7th and 12th graders, quote unquote, agree a lot that anti-drug ads made them less likely to try or use drugs. But what about the flip side of that? What if they're exposed to favorable ads? Look at television, the smoking and the drug use that's done on, the streaming shows. That is going to be the focus of our forum post this week, is the media influence, advertising influence on children and drugs, and whether or not you think it should be banned. So take a look into that when you see this week's forum post and the materials that are provided there. Community strategies. Programs reach out to youths at the highest risk. One of the most successful community-based programs to prevent substance abuse and delinquency is provided by the Boys and Girls Club of America. They have a program called SMART, Skills, Mastery, and Resistance Training. It targets the pressures to try drugs and alcohol and provides education to parents in the community to assist youth in learning about the dangers of substance abuse and strategies for resisting the pressures to use drugs and alcohol. So community strategies. And then finally, in an effort to reduce drug use, we have treatment strategies. More than 130,000 youths between the ages of 12 and 17 are admitted to treatment facilities in the U.S. 52% are referred through the juvenile justice system. So they've already committed some sort of criminal offense or status offense, and they're within the system. Several approaches that are available to treat these users is the multi-systemic therapy, MST, which involves addressing a variety of family, peer, and psychological problems by focusing on problem solving and communication skills. There's also outdoor activities and wilderness training and after-school community programs. And these programs are based on what Alcoholics Anonymous, their philosophy is that users must find the strength to stay clean, and that support from those who understand their experiences can be a successful way to achieve a drug-free life. So these youths participate in being outdoors and doing this training within the wilderness and not being subjected to an actual treatment facility. And then the next level is actually a residential program. And these are for the serious drug abusers, which involve a more comprehensive form of treatment that can include detoxification, counseling, hypnosis, and other forms of therapy. Harm reduction approach to reducing drug use. This makes drug treatment facilities readily available without the fear of punishment. It's for anyone who wishes to overcome their habit and live a drug-free life. So it's, on their own decision making. Health professionals administer drugs to addicts as part of a treatment and detoxification need, part of a program, treatment and detoxification program. There's a couple programs that are readily available. The needle exchange programs, the purpose is to slow the transmission of any diseases or hopefully prevent it or stop it. The methadone maintenance program, which helps to assist heroin users. The feel of the methadone maintenance is it takes away the cravings or satisfies the cravings that a heroin user would have to use heroin. And this has been shown to reduce illegal heroin use and criminal activity, and it's not addictive. When we get to the juvenile justice system, I think next week is our more in-depth talk about the juvenile justice system, or we begin it. We will talk about specialty courts, drug courts, pretrial diversion programs, but I want to note it here because it kind of falls in this category. This harm reduction approach allows courts to use this method of handling juveniles who use drugs in a hope to avoid criminal consequences, as well as the treatment one we talked about previously. But a youth who, on their own initiative, has begun or gets involved with treatment that will, ahead of the game, ahead of being through the court system, it will help with either reducing or potentially, dismissing or not having to go through the court system. But I'll explain that. I'm trying to generalize it, but we'll go into that in more detail when we talk about the juvenile justice system or as a component. Critics warn that this approach, though, condones or promotes drug use. It encourages people to either continue or start using drugs without recognizing the dangers. But on the flip side of that, the advocates see it as a variable interim measure in dealing with drug use. Advocates cite that it helps reduce the number of offenders and overcrowded institutions. And that's the point when it ties in with our specialty courts, is that it often leads to not having someone be incarcerated. And in seeing and helping many of my clients work their way through programs like this, and I'll say most get involved, most are motivated to get involved by not, if they don't want to be incarcerated or they don't want to have a criminal record. So there's some motivation behind that. But there's certainly benefits to having these programs in the communities. I don't think it solves or reduces the war on drugs, but they do help the drug user, and they can be very successful. And maybe having a motivating factor of, well, if I don't do this, I'm going to go to jail. I mean, the alternative is I'm going to go to jail and then I'm going to have bigger problems as my life goes on. And once they're involved, they're very thankful that it all happened. So there are certainly benefits. So what the future holds, The United States appears willing to go to great lengths to keep fighting the drug war, so far has spent well over $1 trillion on it. Prevention, deterrence, and treatment strategies ignore the core reasons for the majority of drug problems, though, which are poverty, family disruption, and alienation. There's some that call for the legalization of drugs. Legalization of drugs would decriminalize drug use to reduce the association between drug use and crime. However, this may actually be a short-term success because studies have shown that this approach could have grave consequences. And when I say the studies have shown, it's shown these, and there's not a lot of studies done on it, and there needs to be more studies done on it, but so far it has shown that with the medical marijuana laws, there have been some consequences. But only time will tell. So, recap of this section, there is a strong association between drug use and delinquency. Juvenile arrestees often test positive for drugs. Chronic offenders are often drug abusers. Though drug use and delinquency are associated, it is difficult to show that abusing drugs leads kids into a delinquent way of life. There are a number of drug control strategies, some relying on law enforcement efforts and others relying on treatment efforts. There are a number of drug education initiatives. DARE is a popular school program prevention program that has been the target of some criticism, but it certainly has been around long enough to know that there's more benefits than none. And of course, the new directions to preventing delinquency involving the family and community in the education, offering outdoor after-school programs, outdoor activities, wildlife training. And, then there's the comprehensive community-based programs and the harm prevention. So that concludes drugs and delinquency. And the next part of the last few weeks of the semester will be focusing on the juvenile justice system.